I think we'll get started. We were asked to hold off for 15 minutes just as the lunch plenary was finishing up. My name is Greg Bishop, and I work at the Human Development Council. We're a social planning and research office based in St. John, New Brunswick, where we work and play on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey people. I'm pleased to be the moderator, timekeeper today. You are here because you were interested in hearing more about challenges to scaling up and innovation in housing first practice. We have two presentations today. The first one, titled At a Crossroad, Expert Perspectives on the Evidence, Implementation, and Future of Housing First. And John Sylvestre from the University of Ottawa will be presenting that presentation. And then following that, we will hear about the Housing First for Youth program, Adoption and Practice Innovation Study. And Ashley Ward from Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab will be guiding us through that presentation. Each presenter will have about 30 minutes. We lost 15, so if they even scale it down by a few minutes, that will leave more time for Q&A, which will follow afterwards for anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. Okay, so please join me in welcoming John up to the table.
So thanks very much. So what I'm going to share with you today is really some findings from some conversations that we had with people who are knowledgeable about housing first over the past, really sort of talking to people, across the three geographical regions, Canada, the United States, and Europe. And really, the impetus for the reason why we wanted to have these conversations with folks was really because of some of the observations that we were having, that despite the strong evidence in support of Housing First, despite its obvious successes, at least in Canada, and despite the number of programs that exist, there seemed to have been a bit of a slowing down of Housing First that hadn't been progressing as well as it could have. The other part that we sort of observed is there seemed to have been, there continues to be a large number of critiques of Housing First. And what was interesting about these critiques that have come is they really are across the political spectrum. So certainly critiques that we would sort of think is coming from more progressive sort of voices, but also critiques happening from the right wing. And so as observers of the field, myself and Nick, we were interested in kind of taking stock of where the field was. And we figured the best way to do that is to talk to people who know more than us, people who are experts. So who are we? Nick and myself were two people who have been observers and researchers in the field of housing, supportive housing for people with serious mental illness, homelessness as well, but haven't really been directly contributing to much of the Housing First literature, so people who we see as advocates and supporters of the field, but not in the trenches doing the research and doing the practice of Housing First, as perhaps some of you have. So what did we do? Well, our aim, as I said, was to take stock of the status of Housing First from the perspective of those who have played key roles in its evolution in North America and Europe. So some of our initial guiding questions, which ends up not really being the kinds of things that I'm going to talk about, is we wanted to sort of learn from people who've been involved in Housing First, their perceptions of its strengths and its challenges, the perceptions of its development and evolution, understanding what Housing First means to them. Is there a common understanding of what Housing First is, or is it quite variable? And what they saw as the future of Housing First. And so we did 27 interviews with folks drawn from Canada, the United States, and across Europe, We had European participants across England, Scotland, Germany, Finland, Ireland, Spain, France, in a pan-European organization. So, on the one hand, it's a varied group, but of course it's a relatively small group, and the findings that we'll share are very much dependent on the people who we spoke to and their particular experiences, though a lot of coherence and a lot of agreement among people who we spoke to, despite the variability in terms of where they're from. And even, in Europe, we'll talk about sort of a European experience, which doesn't really seem to make much sense given that we're sampling from people across a range of different countries. But nonetheless, there is sort of, elements of a commonality in the European experience of around Housing First that we'll talk about and that we'll share with you. When we talk to people who had various involvements in Housing First. We had people who were practitioners, people who were involved in advocacy, knowledge mobilization, involved in policy, and of course people who were involved in research as well. What's interesting, and training, and what's interesting in terms of the people who we spoke to often had multiple different kinds of involvement. It seems like if you get involved in Housing First, there's not just sort of one way you're involved in a whole bunch of different kinds of ways. And we talked to people who were involved in the early 1990s around Housing First, which really stretches back to the beginning of Pathways in New York, to people who had involvements as recently as 5 years ago, or 5 years ago at the time that we interviewed them. Okay. So these are really kind of some general themes that we thought were interesting that came from the interviews. And again, very much dependent on the people who we actually chose to speak to. But I thought these are kind of interesting themes to share with you that kind of really reflected, where Housing First is and where it might be going, and thinking about Housing First, first off as a housing intervention, but also thinking about, the challenge according to the theme of this symposium, really the issues that relate to scaling up Housing First. In this first, cut at the data or look at the data that I'm going to share with you, we're really going to think about Housing First as a systems intervention. And here, we'll talk about what we mean by that and what the people we spoke to meant by that. But we're really going to be focusing here on Canadian perspectives, and where we're relevant. I'll mention some other perspectives from the United States and across Europe, but focusing initially on Canadian perspectives. Later on, we'll do a bit of a comparison across regions on another dimension. But first off, thinking about Housing First really as a systems intervention. And what I mean by that is that for many of us, when we think about Housing First, we've tended to think about it as kind of really a standalone program. If we think about a lot of evidence-based practices, evidence-based programs, we often just kind of think about a package of practices, a variety of elements that can kind of be imported into different kinds of communities or settings without really kind of affecting the systems in which they're implemented, or which the systems in which they're implemented may not really affect how the program operates. And so, that's not really kind of what we've learned Housing First is. It's not really this kind of standalone kind of program that's easily, brought into a community without kind of rippling kinds of effects. So in our conversations, we really kind of, came to see Housing First from the perspective of our participants as a systems intervention in three different ways. First off, that in some ways Housing First is a bit of a systems disruptor. So when it becomes implemented in systems, it changes the systems, or there's reactions, and in some cases resistance in the systems in which it's implemented. So it's a bit of a disruptor, or has been a bit of a disruptor. The other thing about Housing First is that in terms of its success, it's really not only about what happens within the program, that in many ways Housing First and its success hinges on stuff that happens in other kinds of a system. So it's very much dependent on other kinds of systemic elements. And the third one is really that it's not really a standalone program, and that in order for Housing First to achieve its goals, right, to contribute ultimately what we would hope to see it contribute to the reduction of homelessness, it has to be part of a broader systems kind of a response. So we'll explain what we mean by these three things then. So what do we mean by, engendering multiple reactions and adjustments when introduced into a system? There's a number of different ways in which the introduction of housing first in different kinds of systems has engendered sort of these kinds of disruptions, these reactions, these resistances, for example. Part of that is just simply, as we've learned, really engendered by scarcity of resources. We know that in our sector that, that we're not terribly well resourced. So when there's a new program that's introduced, right, there is, and when there's a threat that existing players might lose access to resources, for example, there's all kinds of responses. We've seen that, for example, when funding is earmarked towards housing first, for example. Thank you. It's quite obvious I had a dry mouth, so thanks very much. So when we see housing, that's great, moderator, I appreciate that. So when we see housing first introduced, for example, we see all kinds of sort of adjustments in systems sort of denying that it has, any kind of, anything new to contribute, for example, systems sort of, wanting to sort of say that they're also doing housing first in order to get access to funding, for example. What we've also heard is that, housing first, required different kinds of adjustments in terms of the extent to which it has introduced new philosophies, new practices in a system. So, skepticism about these practices, misunderstandings about these practices. Okay? So, let's see some examples of what I mean by housing first as a potential system disruptor. So, obviously start with, we're already doing this. This isn't new. We've been placing people in housing, so that's a misunderstanding because they don't realize it's a whole kind of framework. It's a model, it's been tested, and so on. So the idea here is that, this resistance of housing first is really not really appreciating the extent to which it is a novelty. People not willing to sort of see the novelty of the intervention and kind of pushing back to it. Oh, the old staircase approach. Like you'd think that the wooden stake had been put through the heart of that long ago, but I know for a fact people working on homelessness who still think it has to be demonstrated that you're ready for housing, right? Like all these years later, there's that. So the idea that it's bringing in new practices and new philosophies, for example. In terms of scarcity of resources, one of the challenges that has come up, especially in communities where there are maybe multiple housing first projects, is without a systems approach, there ends up being a lot of unnecessary territorialism and competition. In terms of new philosophy and practices, the problem, and I saw it in At Home, when you adopt the harm reduction approach, it sometimes gets interpreted that you don't do anything other than harm reduction. You look out for people, which is great, and you have to, but then you don't try and kind of motivate people to work on addictions and other things. So this idea then that housing first as a system intervention is that it's really not a neutral kind of thing that it gets introduced into systems. It's something that systems have had to adjust to react to by virtue of the novelty and the type of intervention that it is. The other thing that we learned when talking to experts is that how housing first function is very much dependent on other kinds of systems. And in some ways, it can even be sort of vulnerable to things that happen in these other kinds of systems, and its successes really depend on the extent to which it can engender changes or support in these other kinds of systems. Now, in our Canadian data, people didn't mention, at the individual level, but certainly at the level of the individual worker, it engenders a certain amount of adjustments and change. But as we're going to see sort of in some of the quotes here, changes at the organizational level. Organizations need to change and adapt in order to do housing first. At the regional, municipal kind of level, in terms of funding, in terms of bylaws, various kinds of changes need to happen in order to support housing first. And at a broader kind of funding and policy level, there's ways of sort of supporting housing first, but there's also ways of stemming the extent to which it continues to grow, limiting its potential. So an organization is saying, well, great, we want to adopt housing first, but they're not always prepared to make the policy changes necessary to make that happen. So I've seen situations where an organization is funded to operate a housing first project struggle because housing first philosophy doesn't jive with their organizational values or policies. On a broader level, then you regress back to building congregate housing, which is what we're doing. That's what the federal government's doing. That's what, in fact, all levels of government are doing because the money's available to do that. Right? So the first couple of things that we've talked about is that when it's a systems intervention because when it's introduced into systems, it engenders some kind of a systemic reaction. It's a bit of a system disruptor, or it has been certainly in the past. The second thing we talked about then is that in order for Housing First to function effectively and to continue to grow, right, it can be sort of it can be supported or it can be impeded by other kinds of systems. And the third thing is really that, you know, in terms of Housing First success, it needs to be part of a whole systems kind of response. And that way, again, it's not a standalone program. It really needs to be sort of embedded in other kinds of things going on in systems. So what we've heard from folks is that Housing First is insufficient for reducing homelessness. And you know, in the United States, especially when Housing First was rolled out nationally, there was the promise that Housing First was going to end homelessness, right? Which really kind of made Housing First vulnerable when it wasn't able to produce those kinds of large-scale changes. You know, because Housing First doesn't address challenges around housing supply, or Housing First does not stem new cases of homelessness. So prevention is, as Stephen likes to talk about, right? So Housing First is part of a systems response. I think that the other challenge is that it doesn't, and I mean it is never meant to, it doesn't address the societal or systemic level drivers of why people, you know, become homeless in the first place. I guess the main misinterpretation is that it's going to solve the problem of homelessness. It's not a limitation of the approach, it just creates the dynamic where people will say, well, look, we've done Housing First, and still we haven't reduced the number of homeless people. First of all, you do have to have, with vacancies, both in the private market or in social housing, and you have to have rent supplements. Or you need to have new construction of supportive housing like buildings. And Housing First does not create housing, affordable housing supply. It only enables people to access how housing for affordable that exists. What we need is systems, plural, add another S, because that homelessness sector has to work well with other public systems. And so, you know, what we need is some leadership that says, points out like 8 ministries and their mandate letters, all of you have responsibility to contribute to the reduction and ending of homelessness. And you need to demonstrate it every year, what you're doing and what results you're having. So this first sort of, you know, collection of themes that we identified by talking to experts really is this idea, you know, this is Canadian data, but it's sort of, you know, in some ways echoed across the people that we spoke to, that it's not a standalone program, it's not an evidence-based practice like other kinds of evidence-based practices. It's very much a part of a system. It engenders system reactions, it's vulnerable to the systems in which it operates, but it also needs to be part of a broader system kind of response. Okay. So the second kind of collection of themes or issues that we kind of identified in talking to experts really had to do with how the context in which Housing First is introduced, you know, can shape how it evolves and how it's understood, the meaning of Housing First, as well as the perceptions of the future of the initiative. And here we really were drawing comparisons across Canada, the United States, and Europe. And it really did seem that, you know, how it was introduced in these different regions had some impact in terms of how people sort of understood the intervention, how flexibly they saw the concept, and what their perceptions of the future of the intervention was. So we know that in the US, for example, the context of the introduction of Housing First was, despite, you know, the claims like in the United States and Canada that there are other programs that pre-existed, but they didn't have the research evidence and they certainly didn't have all the elements that Housing First did. So in the US, you know, we saw Housing First kind of emerge, pathways at least, as a response to a local crisis in New York. But what was sort of interesting about the Pathways model, what was really recognized as doing, was really kind of knitting together a lot of currents of thoughts at that time in the community mental health sector. You know, recovery, supported housing from Paul Carling, for example, assertive community treatment. And what really kind of made Pathways appealing to a lot of people was the extent to which it really was drawing on these various ideas and kind of knitting them together. And it's interesting when you talk to people who were involved in Pathways in its early days, you realize, though, that it really wasn't sort of, you know, a designed program, you know, and then went out and we carried it out. And it was also very much influenced by just demands of the local system, like reporting requirements, for example, what the state was willing to fund or not fund, for example. So the whole point, though, is that you have this slow evolution of a program model in New York, but as we're going to see, but a very, very slow adoption of the model across the United States, despite the fact of its demonstrated effectiveness and its innovativeness. In Canada, again, there were some claims about sort of programs that pre-existed, but really that did lack a lot of the key elements of the Pathways approach. And so the context really of the adoption of Housing First in Canada really seemed to be influenced by the Pathways model. So the observers sort of were seeing what was coming out of New York, some skepticism about the data that were coming out of New York and really whether this program was going to be as effective as it was claimed to be in terms of the published literature. But really, what really appealed to our Canadian participants, our Canadian experts, was this idea that it was sort of innovative, not because it had anything that was radically new in the program, but how it was bringing together these various currents of thought. And how it's kind of weaving together all of these different elements that hadn't been weaved together in a single program before. So the Canadian experience in terms of learning about and adopting Housing First very much was influenced by the Pathways model. That was a bit different in Europe, in the European context. It's interesting talking to folks from Europe and their experience of Housing First, even if they were interested in the idea, there was a certain verging on anti-Americanism in terms of the response to the Housing First model. That we don't have the level of entrenched homelessness here. We've been doing stuff like what they call floating support. We've had housing as a right here for years. We've had harm reduction. Maybe this isn't really adding anything new. What's really new about this? So there was an initial kind of resistance to it. Interest, but resistance and some skepticism. Right, but they also at the time had, a European model that the rest of Europe was kind of learning about at the time, the Finnish model, which had some similar principles and approaches as the American model, but much more of a systemic kind of approach, and also was more willing to integrate congregate housing than what we found in the U.S. And so that context of the encounter with Housing First there in Europe led to a sort of different sort of relationship to the approach, whereas Pathways became really kind of the key model in the U.S., and for our Canadian participants really became the sort of the key definition of what Housing First was. In Europe, we see this sort of a reaction to the Pathways model. So I think Pathways to Housing was pitched as a final product that you could use, and Housing First in Europe was pitched as a policy and development. And so it allowed a bit more pragmatism. And I think we're probably more open to say, well, there is stuff that we don't know. So a bit more openness when approaching Housing First than perhaps we've seen in the other contexts. So how did Housing First really kind of take off in these different regions, and how might that explain some different sort of thoughts about Housing First? Well, really in the U.S., from what we've been told by our participants, there was a slow uptake of Housing First, really until it was endorsed as the preferred housing response to homelessness by the federal government there. And what that led to was the rapid adoption of Housing First, but with really no guidelines, really no definition of what should count as Housing First. And so to the horror of some of our participants, programs that really had nothing to do with Pathways and certainly had nothing to do with Housing First, calling themselves Housing First and becoming funded. The risk being that when these programs didn't produce the outcomes that we were expecting, right, that the negative sort of reaction would be attributed to Housing First rather than to poor examples of Housing First. So, one of our participants saying, Housing First is not defined by the government. The government has no criteria for fidelity other than some very vague notions, and there's no follow-up of are you actually doing it. And for one person, a very strong reaction. I think the policy failures, are tragic. Because one, they applied Housing First to the entire population of homeless people without any data or research to prove that. And then the federal government compelled people to only use it as the only thing that you can do. So in some extent, it's sort of a slow growth, but then kind of almost like a top-down kind of an imposition, not imposition, but sort of encouragement of Housing First in the U.S. In Canada, sort of two elements were really important for our experts in terms of the development and sort of the expansion of Housing First in Canada. One was really seen quite positively, and that's the at-home Chez Soi National Demonstration Project, based on the Housing First model. But really, I think, more so than we see in the U.S., more openness to flexibility, recognizing the different contexts in which Housing First was going to be implemented, that we needed to be flexible to sort of recognize those local contexts and to meet the needs of the different people who we wanted to house in the initiative. One similarity in the U.S., though, was the endorsement of Housing First in federal actions, for example, as well as the adoption of Housing First in a number of municipalities, but without some of the key elements, some of the key aspects that really define the pathways approach. So the concerns expressed by a number of people that as Housing First became more widely adopted in Canada, it wasn't always doing the kinds of things, operating the way we wanted to, certainly in relationship to the pathways model. So according to one of our participants who was involved in the at-home Chez Soi National Demonstration Project, after that, when it was more widely adopted, the model devolved from what we had to anybody can offer the support, which is not true. And so that also sort of felt on let's go cheap, let any organization do it and they can do something, but it's not the same thing as providing comprehensive health care. According to our participants from Europe, really what we saw was a mix of more sort of bottom-up and as well as kind of top-down kinds of actions. And really by the bottom-up part really had to do with the important role of NGOs in Europe. Really there was a sort of a slow incubation of Housing First, with either organizations or boroughs sometime deciding to sort of adopt Housing First. In some of our participants expressing frustration that it was sort of like every sort of community had to have its pilot project and nobody would believe the evidence coming from other neighboring communities, for example, before adopting Housing First, right? But it was a slow kind of growth, what one person in our sample called, the slow process of winning over hearts and minds of Housing First. So very much like not groundswell, but more of a grassroots kind of approach to developing Housing First. At the same time, though, with more kind of top-level kind of support. And so, this is really the housing hub through Fianza, sort of the pan-European organization that was really there to sort of support the development of Housing First across Europe via training, via sort of advocacy, all kinds of things. So in Europe, in most countries in Europe, the homeless service provision, the actual policy for homeless people are delivered by NGOs almost entirely. Really sort of maybe even stronger presence of NGOs as partners of public authorities in the US, I think. We set up the Housing First Hub probably about 6 or 7 years ago, or the idea is at least that old. And since then, the sector has changed, and it's not only due to the work of Fianza or the Housing First Hub, but I think we have managed to sort of get the homeless sector a stick in the delivery of Housing First, and I think that's been important. So differences in terms of how Housing First is developed. So really what have been the implications? We want to think about the implications in two ways. I mean, largely what we see in the US is more of a desire to not expand, these people we spoke to not expand Housing First beyond sort of the core population, wanting to sort of continue to see it as kind of really a recovery program. And when we talk about, and that's sort of really the thing that people talk to us about in the US. So, I think the program is quick to understand, but very difficult to operate quickly. And I think that the reason that it's been disseminated so widely is that the core principles are general enough that people can easily adopt them to their context. Everyone is able to focus on the first two principles, like choice and separation of housing and services. But for me, it's also missed the mark of the origin of the program, which is all about helping people have a better life. And concern in Canada that through these actions that what we've seen is that the concern among some that Housing First has lost its meaning as a range of programs have claimed the title. However, it seems to be at least more flexibility in Canada in terms of how we see Housing First. That we're not as rigid perhaps as some of American counterparts in terms of defining what Housing First is. And the other part is people feel like, for example, if I don't have access to psychiatric services, well then I can't do Housing First. Where at least from my perspective, I would say, no, I don't think that means you can't do Housing First, especially if your program believes that psychiatric services are important and essential, and you're doing whatever you can within your power to try and build in service delivery. In the US, in Europe, really a greater openness to experimentation. And so less kind of, certainly there's great fidelity, and it's been demonstrated that there's fidelity in the implementation of Housing First in Europe, but they very much see themselves as more open to experimentation around what can count as Housing First. Like in the US, it was very clearly a sort of mental health intervention, while in Europe, very quickly, we started to work on Housing First for youth, Housing First for women fleeing to suspected violence. So I think we saw it more as a framework that allows for further development and further specification. So what are the implications then for the future of Housing First? In the US and Canada, some outright pessimism about the future of Housing First. We kind of feel like we're stuck and we're not sure if we're going to grow. When we talk about the future of Housing First, the focus really often seems to be on how do we kind of improve the program itself, but not really talking about large sort of scale, continue to grow and to move Housing First forward. So while I'm a bit pessimistic in Canada, so Canada seemed to be making a move forward after At Home. And I think now we're kind of stuck. It doesn't seem like we're really moving in any kind of positive direction. It seems like we were on a roll and like we've lost some momentum. In Europe, though, we continue to see a fair bit of at least cautious optimism. There's been some, like in Scotland and in France, there's been sort of national actions. But there's still this idea that we're winning over hearts and minds in Europe, and there's still a much more positivity in terms of the future. My hope is that the European dynamics will help sustain the national dynamics, and I think in most countries we'll see growth, but it'll be slow. And I think that systemic change, and also if you look at Finland, in all honesty, they started doing Housing First in the late 80s and early 90s. So it took them 20, 25 years to get to basically functional zero. So I think the time dimension is important. It will take 10, 15, 20 years, and I think we can get that message and linked with the European dynamic. Maybe we'll get there, but I might be wrong. So, in sort of the closing kinds of thoughts, right? So how do we support Housing First to continue to grow, particularly here in Canada? We really have to start seeing the intervention not as a standalone program and just thinking about within the box Housing First, but really thinking about how Housing First relates to and plays in a very complex ecosystem, right? We need to sort of also think about how Housing First, works across sectors. So the problems that we see around, people living in Housing First, whether they're alone, whether they're hungry, for example, with living in poverty, these are experiences across sectors. And so Housing First needs to start thinking about how it works across sectors in order to improve the lives of people that we serve. And then also, in terms of the policy dimension, really thinking about Housing First is not the solution, but it's one of many solutions. So how we really sort of advance it as a policy option aligned with all other kinds of things that we are important to address the big goal, which is ending homelessness. So, thank you.
Thanks, John. Perfectly on time.
I rushed at the end.
I've got some good news. We've been gifted back 15 minutes. So we're going to go to 3:15, which will allow us a half an hour for Ashley Ward's presentation, and she'll be up in just a moment. And then we'll have 30 minutes for Q&A. So if you've got any burning questions right now, jot them down. Don't forget them. We'll get into Q&A in just a half an hour's time, and you can just join me now to welcome Ashley up to present.
Okay. Paige Lassie, welcome all to my presentation. The presentation is about a study that was recently launched entitled Housing First for Youth Program Adoption and Practice Innovation Study. I'm a senior researcher with the Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab, which is co-owned and operated by Away Home Canada and the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness at York University. Greg earlier did a land acknowledgement, so Wailalan for that. I also wanted to acknowledge myself as from the neighboring island of Ukdamguk, which is Mi'kmaq for the shoreline across the way, also known as Newfoundland. I'm from Corner Brook, and I just wanted to acknowledge as well this art by Mi'kmaq artist Chelsea Brooks. Her father was a well-known Mi'kmaq artist, David J. Brooks, and this work is called We Are All Treaty People. And Chelsea says that she started painting at age 2, that she paints only from sort of a good state of mind, and that her father guides her through all of her paintings. Quick overview of my presentation. We'll talk about Housing First programs for youth, and thank you to John, who really set the stage nicely for this presentation with Housing First for Youth coming out of the Pathways model and the at-home Chez Soi model. We'll talk about the budding research evidence for this approach, and then we'll get more into the focus of the study, which is concerning program adoption, implementation, and innovation as pertaining to Housing First and youth programs. We'll go over the study aims and research questions, and then talk about the methods. And if we have time, the knowledge mobilization plan. So just to acknowledge, again, the influence of the Pathways model and at-home Chez Soi project in the influence on Housing First for Youth having emerged from that. And when I talk about Housing First for Youth, I'm really referring to Dr. Stephen Gates's model as having arguably the largest influence on the field. That is sort of part of this research study, and I'll talk about that too. But speaking more broadly, for well over more than a decade actually on my slides here, just correcting myself, Housing First has been a program and a philosophical approach to address youth populations experiencing homelessness relative to the adult models for housing, relative to adult models, Housing First as applied to youth specifically acknowledges and empowers the developmental context of youth as well as their sociocultural context. So a key limitation coming out of Housing First's application to young people was the acknowledgement that it wasn't really developmentally appropriate. There were strides to make in creating the conditions for young people to have their developmental context acknowledged, meaning that we need to have an understanding of where youth are coming from, what healthy youth development is in adolescence and young adulthood, what young people who experience homelessness go through, and then what does it mean to be working towards a healthy developmental trajectory, what are strengths and resilience factors that these young people have, and how do we bolster that in their experiences in recovery, in their spiritual journeys, and so forth. So this model seeks to create the conditions for youth to have as much choice as possible as well. It acknowledges that these young people grew up quickly, and that also there might be discrepancies in the ways that which young people have needs for their different life areas and sociocultural contexts. It also made strides to acknowledge the ways in which programs need to adapt to the sociocultural context of young people. So young people who may be exiting the childcare system, Indigenous youth, BIPOC youth more broadly, have various needs that need to be acknowledged by programs and acknowledged by the staff operating the programs and their communities. A goal of this study, among many that we have, is to map and sort of track programs so that we understand how to support programs that are considering adoption or have implemented and are potentially looking for additional training and capacity building as the program team continues their education. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but so far, we know that there are about 11 programs that are operating in Canada that are Housing First for Youth based. There are 5 in Calgary alone in terms of sites. There are sites in Kelowna and Vancouver, as well as Hamilton, Toronto, Whitby, and Oshawa in Ontario. As John was talking about, European countries are a little bit ahead of the Canadian context when it comes to housing first in youth programs. So far, we have 11 countries who are participating or are interested to participate in the study. We have seen larger scale implementations, and in a small number of countries, there has been an implementation effort at the national level, which is really exciting. We'll have more information about this as I get into the study details. I'll talk more about the context in which these programs are operating. The core principles of Housing First for Youth vary, as I was saying, from the adult-based model, but there is quite a bit of overlap. The first principle is a right to housing with no preconditions, so young people are entitled to housing regardless of their circumstances. There's no treatment mandate that has to be followed. There's an emphasis on young people having choice regarding their housing. Some programs apply principles of Housing First to programs that include, transitional living focus, permanent supportive housing. So there's an effort to move young people towards independence, but as it applies to their context, and they're supported with a rent subsidy that is portable in the situation that a young person might need to move. Youth choice, voice, and self-determination means that young people need to see, identify, and express themselves through all aspects of service delivery, while also being held accountable for the goals that they set and the achievements they'd like to make in the program. It means that young people have a voice in the programming itself as well, typically through, satisfaction surveys, maybe a presence with a youth board or a youth advisory council, or a presence on the agency board. Positive youth development and wellness orientation means that the social, emotional, cognitive, biological, spiritual context of youth, as I kind of spoke about earlier, is acknowledged in the program. So in case management, there's a recognition of young people's strengths and areas for improvement. There is a focus on recovery or a wellness journey, or ways in which young people are moving towards their health and independence. For individualized client-driven supports with no time limits, this means that young people have their service delivery centered towards their goals and aspirations, so they're working towards these things, and there's some flexibility should change need to happen, which with youth populations we know sometimes needs to happen fairly nimbly. It also means that young people are accountable to the service, so attending appointments with their case manager at least once a week, potentially more at the beginning of their program, and to have the space and time they need to achieve their goals, which is tricky in sort of our landscape that will often fund pilot projects that sometimes extend beyond sustainably, sometimes don't. But this model emphasizes the need for young people to have that access if they need it, and to have that as a standard in programs. For social inclusion and community integration, this means that the sociocultural and identity needs of a young person are acknowledged by the programs and are fostered actively either by the host agency or by partners in the community offering such services, and also things like events, recreation, and community involvement, and identifying with your home neighborhood. In our own lab, we have a demonstration project with 3 Housing First Youth programs that were launched in Ontario. Ndayang, which is an Indigenous-led Housing First for Youth project, is still ongoing. The Free to Be and Housing First for Youth projects in Toronto and Ottawa wrapped up earlier this year. They launched between 2017 and 2019. There's a presentation tomorrow happening at 10 o'clock by my colleague Ahmad Bonakdar and his colleagues on the early results of the 24-month follow-up period of the Free to Be and Housing First for Youth Ottawa research. These were conducted as randomized controlled trials to test the Housing First for Youth model. And I don't know if I can plug other presentations, but I just did. So, some positive results there. We're also conducting a literature review on Housing First for Youth, Housing First programs for youth. Our literature review has yielded 9 studies from, or 11 published papers on 9 studies. And we're still sort of working through this, but from the results we're seeing that Housing First programs for youth have been applied to multiple populations with various success. There is some evidence to show that Housing First approaches for youth stabilize housing, as well as feelings of security with housing and a young person's sense of independence. They improve physical health outcomes, decreasing the need for hospitalization and emergency services, as well as mental health outcomes. And they also support family connections. There was one study that looked at the results of decreased child protection service involvement and decreased negative peer influences. Turning now to program adoption, implementation, and innovation, there is much less published on these topics as pertaining to Housing First for youth specifically, especially the program adoption literature. And it's really exciting because we know in field that there is a lot of practice-based evidence happening. If you talk to folks in the field, programs are being implemented, leaders are contemplating whether or not to take these programs on for their agencies and what it involves, but there hasn't been systematic study of this. The broader research area of program adoption offers a lot, I think, in the way of informing things that we're keen to look for in the study. Jennifer Wisdom and colleagues in 2014 published a systematic review of program adoption theories with evidence, and I've abbreviated the results in this table. So there was a look at socio-political and community factors, so having an environment supportive of adoption and financial incentives available, organization characteristics that included a culture of openness to learning, some experience with the innovation characteristics that include being evidence-based and like observably superior to current program or practice. So leaders and staff need to see that, and they also need to see their own values and practices reflected in the innovation. Staff as well benefit, or the innovation adoption benefits when staff have the skills and experience and a tolerance for change and ambiguity. And something that's often overlooked is the program's alignment with service user characteristics. So again, we see the need for beliefs, attitudes, and values to be concordant with the innovation, and for that population being motivated for change or being seen as ready to change. For Housing First for Youth, it's important to understand for us to identify, early adoption issues, the key decisions that leaders need to make regarding program adoption, and how programs can be supported to sustain over time. So some of these questions are, how can we support leaders moving successfully beyond the pilot stage to full implementation? Is it better for leaders to adopt a Housing First for Youth program, or is it better to incorporate principles into another type of housing and supports program that might better fit their organizational context and community mandate and options? And how can programs sustainably be engaged at the start of planning and design and carried through to full implementation? The literature on program implementation is further ahead. There's some great approaches that programs have taken, and in the gray literature, there are quite a few examples of implementation success with Housing First and youth programs. We know that when service partnerships and community are well developed and high, when there are shared values, and when the youth population has similar values to the program, that implementation is more likely to succeed. We also see greater implementation success when there is robust fidelity to the model. What we don't know so much about is how Housing First for Youth programs are doing as a whole. So, we know that there are challenges as well to implementation that we're curious to understand how programs are overcoming, such as, limited housing availability, potentially team challenges in adopting a new innovation, working with young people in challenging contexts, supporting young people to sustain their housing as well, and having programs be empowered with anticipating issues that come forward, like young people have sometimes bad credit or have connections, or histories with the court system. These things come up. Programs are launched, and it delays young people's ability to have access to their housing. John spoke to this in his presentation. To be most effective, Housing First for Youth efforts require a system-wide acknowledgement on a philosophical level, as well as a wide-scale implementation effort with sustained investment where it's geared towards success or where it's seen to succeed. And again, similarly to what he was saying, in Europe, we're seeing sort of slow success. Canada is a bit slower to sort of arrive at certain policies that advocate for youth and mandates that acknowledge youth populations and with respect to receiving service especially. There have been positive movements towards acknowledging issues driving homelessness related to the need to have harm reduction, social determinants of health, advocating for greater housing, but we still see the need for a broader systems change and movement. We also know that as an innovation at the program level, young people do best when they have options for housing, when their needs are met, and some programs aren't so good at assessing these things, so understanding where a young person is coming from or their needs. So having systematic assessment is really important. Also, staff acknowledgement and community acknowledgement of biases, discrimination, these kinds of things. So there's recent published evidence to show that these things are alive and well in places you wouldn't expect in programs for young people. So we have a ways to go as well, acknowledging and doing well with the stigmas that young people face, even in programs. It affects retention, it affects young people's engagement. So these things are important. So I'm arriving at the current study. There are quite a few aims. So what we're seeking to better understand is how Housing First is recognized as an innovative program to address youth homelessness in various communities in Canada and Europe, understand the needs of organization leaders and service delivery teams as they adopt, implement, and build capacity of their youth-focused Housing First programs, understand how Housing First programs for youth are planned and designed to fit the needs of the host organization, as well as the community context of youth homelessness and the needs of housing providers, service delivery partners, youth, and other stakeholders. Understand the model compatibility between Housing First for Youth and other Housing First programs for youth. Understand how Housing First programs for youth are implemented, accounting for the ways in which organizational adaptations, barriers, limits, and facilitators occur, and ascertain the training, capacity building, and technical support needs for programs as they grow and evolve. So we recently launched the study. I think we're 3 or 4 weeks in, which is really exciting. I don't have data for you, which is heartbreaking. That was the original intention. But I can talk about the study design. It's a cross-sectional mixed methods design. So we have a survey package in Qualtrics that participants are filling out, specifically the service team leads. I'll describe the content of that in a moment. We're also conducting interviews with the leads of host organizations, whom we've termed program founders, and the service delivery team leads. And again, we're qualifying this in Canadian and European programs. We have a multifold recruitment strategy, which includes an email invitation through Away Home Canada's training and technical assistance program, passive recruitment through our social media platforms on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, a recruitment flyer through relevant mailing lists, and snowball strategy, asking the interview participants if they know of other Housing First and youth programs in their region. So we're interested to advance theoretical synthesis about the Housing First for Youth innovation as a model, as well as its understanding its broader program uptake through diffusion of innovation theory. So literature review is part of our work. We also want to advance training and capacity building needs, especially understanding how to meet them. We're asking our participants as well to submit to us any publicly available documents about their policy and social welfare context. At the program level, we're interested for programs to share with us their program models as well as their program logic models and other documents about their programs that are relevant. We're planning a descriptive summary of the program characteristics in Canada and Europe. We're also conducting a fidelity assessment through a self-assessment measure I'll go through in a moment to check the program's alignment with the Housing First for Youth core principles. We'll be describing the training and technical needs of the programs and validating a fidelity tool. So the first measure is the Housing First for Youth Site Description Questionnaire. So these 3 questionnaires have been developed in-house. This is 40 questions with multiple choice, drop-down and short answer response types. It's about 25 minutes to complete, and it's completed by the service delivery team leads. So broken down, there are questions seeking to describe the site characteristics, program eligibility and referral, program operations, retention and completion, as well as program evaluation practices. The core principles checklist is program fidelity self-assessment. It consists of 29 yes/no response items and takes about 5 minutes to complete. It is also completed by service delivery team leads, or those most knowledgeable about the characteristics of the program. So it cross-checks the details of the Housing First for Youth core principles with the practices of the programs. And finally, the Training and Technical Assistance Questionnaire is an 18-item multiple choice short answer response survey for team leads to complete, and it asks a range of questions about how and what training has occurred with the service delivery team. It asks across the Housing First for Youth competency areas, the service team leads perception of how their team is performing and where additional skills and competencies might need to be developed, as well as how learning occurs, preferred learning methods, and characteristics about supervision as well. We're aiming to include 10 Canadian and 10 European participants across both interview groups for the qualitative analysis. With the program founders, we're interested to ask questions about, or we are asking questions about, the impact of government mandates and agendas on the development of programs, why Housing First for Youth is seen as a solution to community homelessness, and knowledge about that. Stakeholder involvement and engagement, program planning and implementation, as well as barriers to and facilitators to program uptake. Same deal in terms of numbers with the service team leads. We're interested to ask about program implementation, the team training and capacity building, the program innovation, so the impact, how team leads see their program as innovative, the impact on youth, and its contribution to the community in addressing homelessness, as well as program evaluation practices. For our knowledge mobilization plan, we are hoping to have quite a bit of material come out of this study. We're looking to update the Housing First for Youth guidelines, as well as develop some best practice guidelines or guiding materials for organization leaders with respect to planning their adoption process, insights into what should be considered, as well as planning and design tips. We're also looking to develop a community of practice series, a report series that details the Canadian and European results, and manuscripts for publication and presentations for conferences like these. And that's what I have for you. Thank you. Mayor Latland.